telemetry was our starting point, kind of like our intro from the last little segment that we got into, and it's the thing that we'll get into and we'll cover next. And this is going to be our chance to then start to like add a little bit of fuel to the engine that is LimaCharlie. As weird as that analogy sounds, we can't really do much without getting data in. So even with the best laid ACLs, the best infrastructure capabilities, the best everything else, without actually getting data in that we can work off of or that we can play around with, we're going to run into some problems. With that said, now because we're talking about this from like a training perspective, I want to really break down how telemetry gets into LimaCharlie and ways to bring it in. And I feel like this is a concept that a lot of times gets lost with some folks. Not that that's a bad thing, but it's an important thing to remember when you're setting data up and working to get data in. So when we talk about telemetry, we're talking about signal. We're talking about data in. I don't care if they're logs, if it's a third-party source, if it's some other generic, random, esoteric thing. We're talking about signal. We're talking about getting data into the platform. There's a whole bunch of different types and categories of telemetry out there. In LimaCharlie, we break them down into two. The first one's going to be endpoint telemetry from our endpoint sensor. There's an important denomination there, which is it comes from us. It's our endpoint sensor that's out there. Multi-platform support, but that's not really the important part about it. The important part is the signal that's coming in. When I talk about endpoint telemetry, I am talking about signal from the system, meaning things that the system is doing, things that's happening on that particular system as it is just operating and functioning normally, okay? So from a system perspective, this is often going to be things like processes, network connections, stuff that's happening on that particular system. Users logging in and out, processes starting up, processes being killed, network connections being initiated. We've got some other events that are a little bit more meta events about the platform. So this gives us a chance to really hone that magnifying glass inside of LimaCharlie. So for example, we've got these things here called, that's not the one I wanted. Let me just scroll on my system. We've got these things called code identity events. There isn't a code identity event in the operating system. But what there is a zoom in on, this is a binary. This is a binary that's running. Let me zoom in on that particular thing because that piece of information has been very useful for people doing security in the past. So normal system telemetry is what I'm going to expect from my EDR sensor. Right? Now, I'm not going to compare LimaCharlie right here and now to other types of sensors. I'm just going to say, in order for us to build an effective security approach, we need to be able to see what happens inside of the environment. We need to be able to see what the system telemetry is doing, what processes are running, what types of network connections are being created, because guess what adversaries do when they're on a system? They run and they start processes. They open network connections. They build connections between different systems. That all happens. So I want to have that kind of telemetry up front, right? So when you hear me talk about EDR events, this is the basic stuff that I'm talking about. Signal from the system doing a certain thing. The other type of telemetry is going to be non-LimaCharlie EDR sensor. Now, really quick, just because it's a non-LimaCharlie source doesn't make it any less significant. The reason I started off this whole thing talking about primary, secondary, and tertiary is because for us, everything is treated as a primary evidence source, or you're going to hear me say the word first-class evidence source as well. So regardless of where it comes from, it's going to be ingested, viewed, observed, so on and so forth. I like to insert this quick delineation between us and a normal type of SIM or kitchen sink approach, which is like, hey, just dump everything in, and then I'll have a bunch of databases, or if you're a Splunk or an Elastic user, you'll have a bunch of indices that you can just search through. And every index has a different type of data inside of it. And I've got my Palo Alto index, and I've got my EDR index, and I've got my AWS index. And you build your processes around these different kind of logical silos of data that are in there. Similar kind of approach. I'm going to have those things separated out. I'm not going to make them coalesce, but they're going to be created in the form of sensors. A sensor is essentially an ingestion point, data being brought in from some other type of platform. So EDR sensor, EDR agent, synonymous with each other. You can also have a third-party source sensor. We refer to them in some documentations and around the platforms as adapters, but if you want, you can also call it a log forwarder. That's essentially all it is it's just getting data into the platform from some third-party source. Here's the big difference and why this has to be constructed this way. We create and write the LimaCharlie sensor. the LimaCharlie agent. Let's call it agent from now on just to keep it simple. We create this sensor. So we can easily tell it, hey, I want you to send stuff back up to the LimaCharlie cloud. That's your job. That's your functionality. And it totally gets it. I can't install this sensor and have it natively send data up to CrowdStrike, right? It's not a multi-use kind of platform sensor like that. But every other telemetry source that's out there is not pre-configured, hey, send this data to LimaCharlie. 1Password generates data and you tell it where to send it. Azure generates data and you tell it where to send it, so on and so forth. So we're creating those ingestion streams. So that's what each sensor or adapter represents, is it represents an ingestion point, getting data into LimaCharlie. Now, for that reason, we just have a delineation in the UI between the two. There's an EDR type, and then there's pretty much everything else that's out there. There's this other straggler category for browsers. These are browser extensions that you can install. I'm not going to get into like we have support for all of these things, but we do. But we have support for all these if you've got like a Chrome OS fleet or something you need to manage. But I want to spend a little bit of time here on these particular sources, these third-party sources that come in. We've made it easy to bring in, easy-ish, we've made it easy-ish to bring in a bunch of different third-party sources, but I have to drop a quick LimaCharlie breakpoint in here. And I have to insert we need to change our frame of mind on how you want to bring stuff in. For a lot of other platforms out there, and I'm not going to pick any names, but for a lot of other platforms out there, if I want to bring in Office 365 logs, for example, I'm going to need to connect to the Office 365 API, bring that data in, and then we're done. That's it. That's the way to bring data in. And for a lot of folks, it's really simple. We just type in our credentials, we put in our API key, our tenant, whatever Microsoft gives us, and the connection's done and we're finished. That is a direct cloud-to-cloud connection. And I love when I talk to folks who are like, do you have an on-prem solution? If you don't have an on-prem, we can't utilize this thing. And I'm like, so you use no cloud services whatsoever? And then you come to find out, yes, they do. There's a ton out there. So I always like this kind of discrepancy of like, I don't utilize cloud stuff. And I'm like, pretty sure you do, and that's okay. We'll just leave that off to the side. But what that's doing in most other platforms is you're establishing that really quick API connection. Layer one, that can be done. Hey, I want to connect to Microsoft's API, bring this data in. However, you might have another approach that you need to take. And this is where we get to put on our LimaCharlie architect hats and actually talk about some cool options here. So maybe I'm already sending my Office 365 logs to another place, another storage. Maybe I'm sending them out to an Azure blob, or for whatever reason, they're going to some other third-party platform or something like that. And maybe I don't want to establish a direct API connection, but I would rather tap into that other source instead. And I would rather say, hey, I've already got these logs being stored in another place. I'm just going to go over there and collect them because they're already kind of in this bucket, as opposed to me having to build a new bucket or a new connector. For those of you that are doing monitoring or incident response and you want to tap into historical evidence, this is your chance. Because if I go and I install an API connector, which means I'm going to install a cloud-to-cloud connector between me and, let's say, Office 365, that's a point-in-time collector. From here, going forward, we'll get all the things. What about in the past? What about if I'm using LimaCharlie from a defer perspective and I want historical data? How do I go and collect that? Do I tell the API, give me the old stuff? No, that doesn't work. Unfortunately, it's a point in time going forward. So the only other way to get that data ingested is to go to where it's been historically stored and grab it from there. This isn't possible in a lot of other platforms because everything is N+1 going forward. It's not historical. Same company I was talking about that utilizes those three, but four evidence sources I was talking about, they've gone and ingested AWS back to September 2023, which is the year that they had, because they had an S3 bucket that had old data inside of it, but they were able to go back, and now they're doing an investigation on historical data that if they went direct API, wouldn't have been able to bring in. So let's talk about like kind of one of the big LimaCharlie differences in here. Bringing data into LimaCharlie is obviously possible. The first thing that we're going to ask when you do that is going to be an installation key. We're going to come back to these in just a second. Let's just pick one for fun. But the next question that you've got to answer when it comes to ingesting data is, where do you want to bring it in from? This is a key division that a lot of other things won't expose you to. I view this as a benefit because it lets me, A, pick and choose where might be the best source of data, and 2, it also lets me tap into pre-existing sources that are already there. So I could, if I wanted to, just really simple, say, and which one did I click on here? Anyone remember which one I clicked on? I don't remember. We'll pick Office. We'll pick a Microsoft one just because I know it's got the API connector in there as well. Let's go back here. We'll pick. Give me Office 365, my old favorite here, right? Now there is an option inside of here to just quickly connect out to the Office 365 Management API. That's what this UI is going to do. It's going to help you build out all these different, it's going to ask you for all the different fields that we know you're going to need. You can reference the secrets manager for all of these if you want to. Again, if you want to store all this information inside of that Hive and keep them in there, that's one option. But let's say I had another source. Let's pick on 1Password logs just for fun. Let's say my 1Password logs, same exact thing. I want to connect to the API. These are going to be straight API to API connectors, cloud to cloud connectors that are going to pull those directly in. Well, let's have a little more fun with this. Let's just say, hypothetically, I've got some other log types. I'll pick on syslog in this case, and let's see if syslog is going to do me a favor. There we go. So syslog data, when I tell LimaCharlie I want to bring syslog data in, you're not actually saying on the surface, I need to spin up a syslog server. What you're saying is, I'm going to bring in data that's formatted like syslog data. Next part's going to be, where are you bringing this data in from? Now, we could go the easy route. At the very bottom, I can say, I'm going to configure a syslog endpoint. Now, that right there is the easiest telemetry or data connection we can make. I'm bringing in syslog data. How are you doing it? From a syslog endpoint. Done. That lines up. But what if you had historical data that you needed to tap into? What if you had someone pushing data to some other arbitrary source? What if I had an environment with a bunch of on-prem sensors that had one firewall hole to punch out to some other storage location? The typical security approach, and I've been there before, has been, oh, well, we need to tap into that data too, so could you please give us some more firewall exceptions? And now we're red taping, we're change controlling, we're doing all of those different things to try to tap into this data set. Whereas I could go to the customer and the customer's like, we're already pushing that data up to an S3 bucket. Are you able to tap into that? Instead, that process is already in place. We don't have to disrupt anything. You can literally just peek inside and take that data too. Boom, we're done. So the next thing to then ask is, where do you want to collect the data from? And this is where we can get really creative. And you might be thinking to yourself, like, wait a second, why would I ever be collecting syslog data through a webhook? It just seems a little odd. Syslog's the format, webhook's the ingestion method. Those two pieces can be kind of independent of each other. Just because it's syslog data doesn't mean it has to be a syslog input. I think this gives you all a lot of options in the way that you configure bringing data in, the way that you want to actually go through and ingesting things if you put these different pieces together. Sometimes it's really straightforward. So I'm going to bring in Azure Kubernetes service logs. How are you going to bring those in? They're probably going to come in through an Azure Event Hub. But did you also know that you can configure some Azure data to go out via webhooks? Can anyone give me, and I'm going to make it interactive for a brief second here, why would I want to go through a webhook as opposed to a storage service? Anyone know? Which one costs more money? The storage service. So if I wanted to minimize my costs, a lot of companies out there will give you webhook outputs for free. Meaning I'm tapped into some cloud provider or something like that. They're going to let me send webhooks out for nothing, or I can pipe everything to a storage blob. Now, you can pipe to the storage blob for free, but you're going to be paying for the storage blob. So again, put that cloud provider mindset, put that cloud provider hat on, which is you can easily transfer data to an S3 bucket for free. What they're talking about is endpoint to endpoint for free. But paying for this service and paying for the bucket, you still got to pay for both of those things. If I can find a way to streamline or eliminate either one of those costs, I'm going to do that. I'm absolutely going to do that. And webhooks is one example of where you can usually output for free and whatnot. Webhooks can also be an input method, but we'll talk about that one later this afternoon. So that's kind of how things get broken up from an ingestion perspective. I added this little monologue in here towards the end of last week because as I was working through and helping some folks set up some adapters, some input methods, there was definitely a little bit of confusion. It's like, wait a second, I want to send you syslog data. Why would I be configuring an S3 bucket? to send you syslog data. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to pop up a syslog listener in the cloud for you because that's going to be very dangerous. So instead, syslog is the format, Office 365 is the format, Okta is the format, the parsing, if you will. The ingestion method can vary if applicable, right? If applicable. Now, sometimes the ingestion methods are also going to depend on the platform as well. And then, of course, if you've got anything you want to send in, and we're going to play with this in just a few minutes here, you can also send in any arbitrary randomly named data that you want to. Not named, but any arbitrary random format data, as long as it's in some sort of a structure. So we've also got pre-built parsers for, hey, LimaCharlie, I don't know what this data is exactly, but I know it's JSON. I don't know what this data is, but I know it's XML, right? So you've got the option to just simply bring those things in. I'm going to tell you all right now, the ability to just send in native XML data and have LimaCharlie translate it to JSON for you is like one of our biggest hidden engineering feats, but I'll just leave that off to the side. Let's talk about what happens when you send external telemetry in. For 90% of all telemetry that comes in, it's going to be represented as the event that you send it in. We're not cutting fields out. We're not normalizing to what we think is the right data. And I'm not telling you, oh yeah, you're sending me Okta logs. Well, historically, only these 4 things have mattered, so we're just going to remove everything else, right? Any data you send in, we're going to represent the full thing in here for you. However, there are certain cases where we do translations. If it's an EDR platform that you send in, so if you send me Carbon Black data, if you send Defender, if you send in CrowdStrike data, that data actually not only retains the original message, it also gets normalized into LimaCharlie syntax as well. Big reason there is so that your detection and response rules are easily transferable. So I could write detection and response rules for LimaCharlie. They will also apply to that brand shiny new CrowdStrike telemetry that I'm bringing in. They will also apply to that brand shiny new Defender telemetry that I'm bringing in. And that way your rules are transferable across sources. So I like having that feature set in there as well. But I will tell you all, it's really the only conversion that we do is that translation. But the original message is retained as well. When we talk about detection and response capabilities this afternoon, you'll see how that changes a little bit. Now, that's my endpoint. And that's my cloud-based adapters. Everything I just described to you from a third-party source can also be done from a binary perspective. This may sound a little weird, but let me talk to you about this one and how it works, okay? So if I come back, I don't want this one. Let me get a different source here. We'll bring up, which one was I looking at before? We'll bring up Entra, because Entra's fun, because Entra's been the headache of my life for the longest time here now. We'll do not webhooks. We'll set up an event hub. We'll talk about the on-premise one. Sample adapter name. And this is my connection string, right? There we go. Okay, cool. So what I just described from a third-party source, so non-EDR agent, can be brought in via any means that you want. Okay, so remember I said syslog data can be brought in via S3 buckets. Syslog data can be brought in via an Azure Event Hub if you want to. I can bring in 1Password logs through a pub sub. Different ways to structure that together. Let's just say, hypothetically, you didn't want to create a cloud-to-cloud connection. Let's just say you were like, hey, all my data, my syslog data is going to an S3 bucket, but I don't want LimaCharlie's cloud to tap directly into that S3 bucket. What I would rather do is I would rather have one more stopping point in between that. I'd rather have some sort of a switch where I can facilitate that and say, all right, switch, I want you to connect to S3 and grab that data, and I want you to send it up to LimaCharlie, right? Can anyone think of why on earth you'd want to do this? Why not just create a cloud-to-cloud connector? So you can what? So you can switch, oh, I love that answer. So you can switch vendors easily. So you can switch vendors easily. That's a good one. So you can switch to LimaCharlie. No, we'll leave that aside. So you can change vendors. I like that. Maybe your customer requires that you have a bastion system in between. Maybe they don't want to enable cloud-to-cloud connectors. Maybe they say, hey, we already gave you all the permissions you need to S3. We're not giving you any more permissions to our platform, which you would need. If you were to set up a separate LimaCharlie adapter or a separate connection, you would need ACLs, you'd need an account, you'd need an API key, or any of those things for any of these other services. You may, as I mentioned, want to have that kind of intermediary. Maybe data needs to flow through a proxy. Maybe data is flowing through or being teed off to another location. So I'll give a really easy example. It's a LimaCharlie architecture specific thing. All of our telemetry includes a year of storage. Maybe you need 7 years of storage for regulatory requirements. So as data is being ingested, you're teeing off to a cold storage somewhere and you're just forgetting about it. But that process is being done in place. Regardless of what the setup is, you might have a need to sit in between. That's where this binary option comes into play. And this is kind of neat. I'm going to zoom in on this part down here. You've got the ability to configure what's known as the adapter. It is a binary that you would download. You've got the ability to configure it to be that kind of middle point. I want you to connect out to this S3 bucket, grab all this stuff, and I want you to pipe it out to this organization, and that's done through a series of configurations here. I'm using this as a little bit of an introduction to the adapter, which I'll get to in just a second here. But that adapter becomes a really useful tool for you to say, I want to connect these two things, but I want to be the one that's in the middle to connect them. And then as that data gets ingested, you're more than welcome to kind of do what you need with it. And it provides the full string for actually how to get all these started. I'm kind of scrolling. Hopefully, I'll zoom in a little bit here. Hopefully everyone can see me scrolling. Well, I'm scrolling the page there. Let me zoom back out, and I'll just scroll through this part. We'll zoom in a little bit up here. And it's got the full command at the bottom with all the different options you would need. And this is where I'm saying, look, hey, I'm going to deploy, that is not what I wanted at all. And now we're looking at telemetry. Let's hop back there 1 second. This is my token. And yep, we'll just go there, go here, there, perfect. We're back down here again. And this is where I'm saying, hey, adapter, I'm going to deploy a 1Password collector, but I'm deploying you as a binary to get there. Here's all the different options. Here's my installation keys. Here's my organization ID. Here's the platform, meaning what type of data are you sending in? I'm sending in 1Password data. How are you sending that data in? I'm sending it in via the API. Here's all the different statistics and things that you would need to get there. Not statistics, data. Here's all the different data points you would need to get there. So there's a multitude of ways to deploy these. And I think that binary becomes a super useful way to like say, hey, I want to have something in the middle that kind of connects, kind of collects this data. So there's that cloud-to-cloud option, and then there's that binary on-prem option as well. The versatility and the ability to kind of work through a bunch of different client setups there, because I know from a monitoring perspective, some of you have your own server inside of your customer environments, like you operate out of that server. That's where your data collection point is. That's your configuration. That's your peek into their environment. In other cases, I know you've got the management API keys, and you're able to create your own connections as need be. In other cases, you're given read-write access to a bucket and told, good luck, go monitor these things. And maybe sometimes that's what you require. We've done some work with some folks before who have typically done a lot of monitoring via Microsoft Sentinel. They don't have access to Defender. They don't have access to the other stuff inside of Azure. They literally have read access to Sentinel, and that's it. How successful do you think that job is? It's very tough. It's very tough when you limit your security team. And I feel like it's kind of like running a pen test, but scoping it to one system. And you're like, all right, you can do anything you want to this one system. And it's like, I got domain admin on that one system. And it doesn't really do much, and it doesn't show you the scope of the environment either. But with that said, I wanted to take a look at one other thing that you can do to bring random arbitrary data in. And I pick on these different sources like JSON and XML and whatnot as a way to go through and test and bring different adapters in. And we're going to try and do this in 20 minutes here. We're going to try. So hang tight. I'm going to see if I can't make this happen. Wow, that is not what I wanted at all. Give me 1 second. I know you can't see what I'm doing. Don't worry, that's the point. I'm like food networking this behind the scenes here. And we're going to make it happen. LC, mission control, there we go. I'm about to share my screen to this other thing. Don't worry, AV. I know you can't see what I'm typing. I'm going to get there. Hang tight, hang tight. Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm going to hop over. And, oh, wait, before I do, let me talk about one other thing that I almost forgot to mention. You might have noticed in here that there's some evidence sources that feel a little endpoint-ish, and you might be wondering what these are. So the first one is going to be Windows event logs, and the second one is going to be Mac unified logging. Both of these things are on endpoint logging mechanisms. So your first question should be, wait, Matt, you have an endpoint sensor or an endpoint agent. Why don't I just deploy that? Cool, you totally can. But maybe you don't want to collect all that data. Maybe you've already got an EDR sensor in place. But if you've ever played around with like the Splunk forwarder or Logstash or any of those other log collection tools, that's exactly how you can think of these two as well. It is a binary that I can deploy on the system that allows me to connect Windows event logs or allows me to connect Mac unified logs. Now, there's a lot of LimaCharlie people in the room here, so I'll happily say, one of them might get upset at me for saying this, but whatever. You can also task the EDR sensor to do this. And it is significantly cheaper to use the EDR sensor to do this as well. Significantly cheaper. The Mac Unified Logging System is essentially the Windows event logs for Mac. It is that underlying super verbose system that captures millisecond or nanosecond by nanoseconds of what happens on the system. I have done a couple of webinars on them. I'm not going to repeat any of those here. I'll just say it's a very verbose system. Windows event logs, same exact case. Very granular logging system underneath the Windows subsystem. You can tap into either of those using just a log forwarder, or you can tap into them using the EDR sensor. That's why you see these two like endpoint-ish ones sitting in here. But the one that I'm going to pick up on is going to be this JSON one right here. Let's just say we had some random JSON source that's out there in the world, whatever it might be, and we might simply say to ourselves, hey, I need to collect this thing. I need to collect this particular JSON data that's out there. I don't know what it is. I don't know exactly what I'm looking for here. So I'm going to need to find a way to bring this data in. Now, we could look at cloud options. So I can connect it to an SQS. I can bring it in via a webhook, Azure, PubSub, whatever it might be. I can also, and this is the cool thing, remember that binary I told you about? That adapter that I can use to facilitate cloud-to-cloud connections? It is simultaneously also a syslog listener, if I want it to be. It is also simultaneously a file reading tool, if I want it to be. So that one binary can be anything I turn it into. If I need to deploy a syslog listener really quickly, that's that same binary. If I need to connect O365 to LimaCharlie, same binary. If I want to go and ingest a terabyte of IIS web logs, same binary. Again, versatility. I think we make it super simple to just kind of carry this thing around with you and make it easy to use. I'm not going to necessarily use the, I should mention as well, the other option is the binary can also just be a standard in listener. So if you've got some arbitrary whatever that you don't really know what data it is, but you want to get into LimaCharlie, just turn on the file listener and just pipe it to it, and you're done. That's it. Really easy to bring in. There's another method to this, which is our file adapter, which is where I can tell the LimaCharlie log forwarder or adapter, again, I'm going to use these words synonymously, I can say to it, hey, I want you to go listen to a file. I want you to go pick up a file on disk, and I want you to ingest and bring in that data. That's what we're going to work on right here. So notice at our sensor downloads options, we've got the ability to pull down the EDR, the agent, or I've got the ability to pull down the adapter, the log forwarder. I'm messing around on a Linux system. I'm going to copy the 64-bit Linux one just because we're having fun. First things first, I've got this random arbitrary JSON source. I don't know what this is. Anyone know what this is just by looking at it? Come on, network engineers. Wow. Congratulations. Anyone know what type of alerts these are? Hey, there we go. I like it. This is Suricata data. This is Suricata alerts. I don't know what it is, but I might be running a long-term monitoring engagement, or I might be doing all sorts of stuff, and client says, hey, this stuff's really important. I need you to ingest this data. Also, I don't know if anyone notices here, this data is over 9 years old. I don't know if anyone saw the timestamp at the bottom, but this is from an old CTF from a while ago. But hey, it's JSON and it works. So here's the typical IR approach. Y'all ready? Ooh, random file. Let me cat this thing out. Let me pipe it to a tool like JQ so I can get some familiarity with what the JSON looks like. And we're going to scroll around and be like, I think this field looks important, so on and so forth. That's cool and all that. Not really what we're looking for, though. What I want to do is find a way to bring this into LimaCharlie. So I know you can't see my screen, don't worry. I'm intentionally staying in the terminal. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring down our sensor, right? And I had to drop a couple of curl options in here. Just a quick note for you all. The URL that you get out of the web UI is actually a forwarder to the CDN, so it's dynamically changing. So make sure if you download the sensor from the command line, you give it a kind of follow the link type of thing, which is the TAC L in curl. So now what I've got is this binary. We're going to rename this to LC adapter, just so we can follow our naming inside of the browser. And I've got a couple different files in here. I've got my JSON and I've got my LC adapter. Because we want to give permissions to everything, we're going to make that LC adapter executable. And then just to have some fun, we're going to run it. All right, well, we're gonna have some fun in troubleshooting this one and figuring out exactly what's going on here. But nonetheless, I'm gonna talk about bringing the data in, and I've already got this ingested because I'm smart like that. But when we go and we bring the adapter down, we've got to take note of a few different configuration options as well. So it's not just, let me run the binary. We're gonna also need to say, how am I bringing this data in? How am I gonna get it represented inside of LimaCharlie? What am I gonna do to get it there? So the first thing we're going to need is an installation key. I didn't mention this in our first session because it is so closely tied with getting telemetry in that it feels more relevant to bring it here. An installation key is going to be your first choice, your first option to segment stuff that comes in. I'm going to use some of the examples I've got drawn up here. You might notice I've got a bunch of different installation keys set up in here. I was testing Atlassian or Jira data. I've got some Debian systems. I was testing GitHub, testing IIS, Microsoft Entra ID, Sublime, Office 365. I create a new installation key for pretty much any source that I'm going to bring in because I want to segment it off. I want a way to visually segment it inside of the platform. If I bring in GitHub audit logs, that is not Windows data. I don't want to treat it that way, one. Two, the platforms inside of LimaCharlie are addressable. After lunch, we're going to talk about detection and response rules. I can write a detection and response rule that says, for Windows, do this. And imagine if I had everything coming in and flying under Windows data. I'm going to run up with a lot of confused data points. Three, it gives me the ability to quickly remove it if I need to. Let's say I go and I do a bunch of Office 365 testing, and I don't really need that anymore. I'm done. So I'm going to get rid of this installation key, and I'm going to get rid of all the detection and response rules associated with it. If I had everything coalesced under one roof, it makes it really difficult to do that. So I recommend keeping things segregated as much as you can. Furthermore, I can also tag at an installation key level. This is your other way of segmentation and segregation. So I'm going to treat my Windows servers and my Windows workstations differently. Can anyone think of why I would do that? I know, it's almost lunchtime and I'm asking you questions. Why would I treat Windows workstations and servers differently? Come on, IR people. All right, so directionality and position in communications is one reason. I'd want to understand clients talking to servers. Why else? There should be less going on servers. Easier for me to baseline. My detection and response rules, very different. Very, very different in that sense. Would I expect a remote desktop server to have remote desktop running? Yeah, absolutely. That's its job. Would I expect the file server to have remote desktop running? Probably not. So it makes it really easy for me to kind of use my detection and response rules to segment those out. Now, let's go a step further. Would I expect 3 computers in the accounting department to have remote desktop turned on? Absolutely not. Especially not inbounds. Maybe going outbounds if that's inside of my policy, but understanding the directionality, understanding the system functionality also allows me to write much more effective rules. And we'll talk about that part after lunch as well. But like I said, being able to segment and separate, I've also gone as far as separating installation keys based on operating system type. So here I've got them generalized into like Linux servers, but I've created like a CentOS key before. I've created a Debian key, as you can see up there. And I'll even go as far as to use those keys individually as well, primarily because update cycles are different, versioning might be different, kernel versions, depending on whether I'm actually able to maintain upgrades. I want to keep all those things separate so that my rules and my approach towards them can remain separate as well. Finally, just as the platforms are addressable, the tags that you associate with your systems are also addressable in your detection and response rules. So you can go as far as to say, if it is a Windows system or a Windows platform and it is a Windows server, do this. If it's not, do that. And I want to have that decision point readily accessible. A lot of times, you might find that correlation done between a couple of different products or platforms. So I might have like an EDR platform coupled with an asset management platform, and those two things might be tied and working together. The ability and the confidence that those things are always integrated effectively is the thing that I would question. I would rather say when you get to telemetry deployment and you're giving packages out to your customers or into your environment, I would say, here's your Linux install, here's your Windows install, but on this side, we segregate servers versus workstations, and I promise you, from a deployment perspective, they do as well. So here's your Windows Server install package, here's your workstation install package, here's your Linux or whatever it might be. But when we're creating additional non-EDR agents, we have the ability to associate those with installation keys as well. So I can create one really quick, and I'm just going to call this Suricata Alerts. I'm going to tag this Suricata, network, NDR, anything else that might be relevant to my organization is a tag that I'm going to throw in here. Now, only because this is me and my environment kicking in here, I'm going to throw a dash testing at the end, because I'm going to want to have the ability to say, okay, here I'm just testing. We're not in prod yet. When I get to prod, it needs to be refined. It needs to be a well-oiled machine ready to go, right? And now, if I scroll down, because thankfully this thing is sorted alphabetically and by capitalization, I've now got this Suricata Alerts installation key. This installation key, any data that comes in under this tenant and with this installation key is going to fall under that bucket. Suricata Alerts testing. That's how those things get together. That's how data gets ingested. All right. Over here, I've got the ability to rip that to copy that installation key out. I can associate it with either an EDR sensor, an agent, or a log forwarder, an adapter, if I need to. So sensor keys or installation keys can also be used in kind of a switch out manner if need be. You can use them dynamically. So I'm going to hop down here and I'm going to grab my adapter key for that, because I want to talk about something else that we can do with the adapter. All right, so let's hop over to our command line and let's talk about something else that we can do here. I'm gonna get rid of this. So, as I mentioned, I can utilize that adapter binary that we've got, and I can configure it to be a file-based adapter. The sample that I got out of the web UI was running the adapter, followed by all those different flags and options that tell the adapter, here's the type of data you're bringing in, here's where you're going, here's what you're doing, so on and so forth. All that's fun and cool and whatnot, except it becomes really unruly to manage after a while. So something else I wanted to walk through with everyone was utilizing the file-based configuration to actually spin up and create a thing if need be. And this is a really cool way to say, I've got a data. If we're going to create a cloud adapter, we've got the ability to create that here in the web UI. We've also got the ability to create that on the command line. So if I take that binary and I spin up that Azure connector or whatever it might be, I'm going to see that cloud adapter represented here, but it's going to be in the form of that binary. If instead I go and I ingest like a file, or if I go and ingest something that's on disk, or I create a syslog listener or whatnot, I'm just going to have a separate sensor being represented in here. And that's the thing that I kind of wanted to walk through and demonstrate, only because I think this would be useful for folks from a testing perspective. So, as I mentioned, I've got this set of JSON data, which represents Suricata alerts. I want to ingest this into LimaCharlie. The way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to tell the LimaCharlie adapter, hey, you're a file listener. I want you to tap into this particular JSON file and bring this data in. I can configure that by running the adapter with a bunch of different options, such as things like client.installation key equals this, and then client.oid, so on and so forth. That seems like a lot of data to put together. So one of the big things that you can use to test life a little bit easier is you can actually configure all of this data inside of a YAML file. And this is going to become your configuration for this. Now, does everyone here want to have a chance to make fun of me? All right, here you go. You ready? There we go. Now you can make fun of me if you want to. I'm okay with it. If you don't get that joke, then I'm okay with that too. I'm in nano. Oh, no one. Okay, all right, good. I like this. I like this. Okay, I like this crowd. You guys are fun. You guys are fair. Okay, let's hop over here, right? Alerts.only.json is my file. Now, this is the same type of information that you would provide in that really complex command line string. The only difference is I'm using a YAML file to help manage it a little bit better. And I'm building this out intentionally the way I'm building it out because I'm missing some details in here. But I wanted to use this as a chance to talk to everyone about what we're actually doing. So when you're configuring an adapter, or when you're configuring a log forwarder from a file-based perspective, remember that hierarchy I talked about. I'm configuring this binary to pull data from a certain source and send it up to LimaCharlie. All right? That binary is in the middle of all this. I can configure it to be, as I mentioned, a syslog listener, just a standard and endpoint. I can configure it to connect to S3 or Azure or whatever I want. In this case, I'm configuring it to tap into a local file. In this case, right here. So the first thing I'm going to do is tell the adapter, you're going to be a file listener. First thing that's going to happen. Now I need to tell the adapter or the log forwarder, where do I want you to send data? Well, those are going to be all of my different client options fields. And let me make this translation for you so we can see what that looks like on the regular command line. If I go over and I just kind of create a new sensor, I mean, Zoom stuff needs to get out of the way. If I go and I say, let's bring in AWS CloudTrail logs, we're just going to pick a random installation key. We're going to bring it in from an S3 bucket. We're going to bring it in from an on-prem. I think I'm going to have to provide all these values, right? You ready? Value 1. That's not how you spell value. Okay, let's just make all this fun. This wouldn't actually work, just an FYI. But if I come down here and I tell LimaCharlie, hey, I want you to give me the binary version of an S3 connector, I'm going to have to provide it all of these installation keys. client_options.identity.installation_key. Well, guess what? That's all YAML syntax. If I hop over here, client_options.identity.oid, these are all the same fields. So for everything that connects in, I've got to provide it a OID, my organization ID. I've also got to provide it an installation key, which is going to be installation_key, and I'm going to go grab that key out of my platform, so on and so forth. So this is a really cool way to actually go through and say, I've got some random arbitrary data. Let me just ingest this stuff. Let me just test it out and see what actually happens here. So I went and grabbed this out of the web UI. I'm going to drop this inside of here. I'm probably going to need to change the organization ID because I think this is from another test organization. Luckily, I didn't give you both in the same place, so you're not going to be able to test them. Oh, it was the right organization key. Oops, organization ID. We'll copy this. We'll paste that in there. And what we're doing up until now is we're just configuring the adapter to say, here's how you get in. Here's the keys to knock on the door and to tell LimaCharlie, hey, I've got some data for you. If those two things line up, you're in. Now the adapter needs to know, or the platform needs to know, what are you sending me? I am listening to a file and I am sending you JSON data. So that's going to be my platform declaration is going to be JSON. Guess where that comes from? The same exact list that we looked at in the very beginning. So JSON data from a file, that seed key is going to be a little bit more of a secret value that we're going to use just to have a unique identifier for the sensor. I could call this like suricata test 1. As long as that seed key remains the same, I can bring this adapter up and down as much as I want, and it's going to go to the same place. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. Everything else from here on out, not required. The only other piece I need to provide is what file do I want you to listen to. Now, I've got a local file stored in this directory right here called alerts-only.json. So I'm just going to simply say, I want you to listen to that particular file. Right here, right now, we've just built a local file log forwarder. It's going to tap into that JSON, just basically read those lines out and pipe them up to LimaCharlie, and we're done. Now, some of you, if you've done this before or you've walked through it, you might be saying to yourself, wait a second, Matt, that's just like random suricata data being sent in. And I will agree with you 100% and say, yep, yeah, you're 100% right. It is just going to be random suricata data. There's not going to be much of interest that's going in there. So, and I'm sorry for doing this, but it's going to happen. I'm going to hop over to our documentation, which I know I've told a lot of you, like, just go check out the documentation. You'll see how it works. But inside of the documentation, you'll actually see all the different configuration options that you have. And this is where we get into the mapping part of that YAML. And this is where I can go a step further and say, hey, LimaCharlie, I'm not just sending you a bunch of JSON data. I also want to declare and change how that data gets represented in the platform. So mapping is where I can morph. And I can change things such as the timestamp. I can change the type. I can change some of the different fields. I can replace fields. I can transform them if I need to. And what that's going to do is it's going to let me, the analyst, the ingester, have control over how that data gets represented in the platform. Eventually, and I'm only fast tracking this one part just because I talked for a while and lunch is like right at the door. Eventually, what I want to end up with is something like this. I want to end up with a point where I'm ingesting that suricata data into LimaCharlie. Here's that log entry that I was telling you about earlier. Here's that full JSON representation of all that suricata data off to the right-hand side. There's my flow information, my event, the alerting, the protocol, the destination IP, so on and so forth. But what I did is I took that mapping off to the side, and I said, hey, I want you to treat the category field. I want you to treat the category field as the actual event name. So notice what's represented in, I don't know, khaki or brownish over here, reddish, whatever color that looks like to you. That's what's going to be represented. One thing I did not do is I didn't modify the timestamp. I kept the timestamp as an ingestion point, primarily because I'm bringing this data in. I don't necessarily want to be running 9 years in the past to try and track this data down. But long story short is, this is how we go through and we manipulate data. And manipulate it, I don't mean we change it. I mean we manipulate the way it looks in the platform by telling LimaCharlie, I want you to use this field as a representation of the event type. I want you to use this as a timestamp. I want you to, maybe you decide as part of your analysis, this flow information is completely useless to you. You could tell LimaCharlie, hey, instead of ingesting it all because it's just in the way, just drop it. Just get rid of it. Or you might say, I want to create a combined meta field that actually adds all of these things together and gives me a total of the different packets sent between and everything. You have more than enough capability to do that. And as I mentioned, that's all done in the mapping parts of the YAML file. During lunch, I'm going to finish building out this YAML file, and I'll share it with everyone just to show you what's kind of happening there. I talked a little bit longer than I expected on that one. We are right at lunchtime, but that's going to be module 2 for us, getting telemetry in, different types of telemetry you can bring in. The biggest takeaway for everyone here is, first off, the differences between an agent or a sensor versus an adapter or a log forwarder. They're all sensor types, but the different types of data they bring in is going to be critical. The second big takeaway from this one is going to be, what are you bringing in and how do you want to bring it in? I want you to understand the division in those two things, because that's going to help you build a much more robust input method, number one. Two, it's also going to make it a lot easier for you to ingest different data types from your customers or things that your customers might have. So here's the question, or here's the change of the question, if you will. You might have a customer scoping interview that says, hey, I need to collect in Microsoft data. Can you please give me access to your Azure tenant? That might change to, do you already have your data being sent to a blob somewhere, and can we just tap into that? Guess which one you can start up a lot faster? The second one. If there's already a pre-existing data source, it's a lot easier to tap into some of those as opposed to, let's create a brand new route for me.